Morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's lovely to see you all here today. Happy New Year, if it's not too late to say such a thing. My name is Duncan Wood. I'm the director of the Mexico Institute here at the Wilson Center. We're waiting for one of our panelists who is in the building. We've seen him already, but he's disappeared, the elusive David Shirk. But he's around here somewhere, and he will pop up at the most unexpected moment, I'm sure. Let me just say a few words of introduction. Unfortunately, I have to travel today, so I won't be able to stay for the whole thing, but I will be able to catch up on everything on video afterwards. And so I know that if you said anything bad about me, Edna, okay?
But we can edit.
Okay, fine. This is the, as you can see, it's the 8th annual Security and Rule of Law Forum. Here at the Mexico Institute. It was an idea that we came up with 8 years ago, and the idea was that we would try to set a time each year, the beginning of the year, where we could do an evaluation of what had happened over the previous year in security, public security and rule of law. We always try to have new research. Come on in, David. Come up to the stage, please. You see, he likes to make an entrance. Oh, okay, that's fine. You're going to sit down and no one's going to notice. We always try to launch new publications at this event, and we're very fortunate to have two excellent new publications. One from Inigo Guevara Moyano, which is on Mexico's National Guard, an evaluation of the National Guard after the first year of the AMLO government. Mexico's National Guard, when police are not enough. And a terrific paper looking at the evolving drug trade in the Americas by Selena Realullo, who has written many great things for us over the years. These two papers are going to be available on our website. There are copies outside as well, so please take them. And as usual, the papers that we produce are not just analytical, but they are propositive, putting forward directions for public policy. I am deeply indebted to our colleagues for traveling up from Mexico, from across the country here to be with us today. It's wonderful to have the support. We have a number of our global fellows who participate regularly in our events. This opportunity in this event is really to not just launch the new research, but to do this evaluation of Mexico's security strategy under Andrés Manuel López Obrador. And of course, as most of you in this room know, we're still really waiting for a definition of that security strategy. We've heard pieces of it, and speaking with a former Mexican ambassador yesterday, I asked him, what can we actually say about this? And the response was, well, it's very, very difficult because we only have half of the story so far. We don't really know what the full strategy is. The Mexican government had actually confirmed to send a speaker to us, and we were very grateful for that. Unfortunately, U.S. Attorney General Barr is making a trip down to Mexico City this week and will meet with the Mexican government tomorrow. That meant that that speaker was canceled, unfortunately. We are hoping to confirm a speaker from the Mexican government in the next month, so please look out for an email or check our website to see when that's going to happen. As I said earlier on, our role as the Mexico Institute when we talk about security and rule of law is not just to be critical and analytical, it is to be propositive. And one of the things that has come out of recent conversations, which I think is transversal, it goes across every single area of public security and in particular security cooperation with the United States, is the question of trust. And on the bilateral level, we can see that over the past 3 years, trust between the two governments has really taken a beating. And in particular, of course, we can point to many of the inflammatory statements by leaders in this country. In particular, the President of the United States has made a number of very critical inflammatory statements about Mexico. However, cooperation has continued, and I think that's a remarkable thing. That is testament to the strength of institutional mechanisms. Trust has also taken a beating because of specific incidents in Mexico, and I'm thinking particularly of the botched operation to bring in El Chapo's son in Culiacan in the fall of last year. One of the questions I hope that we get the chance to discuss today is how do we rebuild and strengthen trust between Mexico and the United States on security issues. And I would like to emphasize once again that institutions matter a great deal. strong institutions in Mexico, reliable institutions in Mexico, but also thinking about the creation of bilateral security institutions that can really help to strengthen those levels of trust. Thank you to the staff of the Mexico Institute for organizing this. And in particular, I would like to thank Eric Olson, who is a dear, dear friend, obviously one of the most renowned experts on Mexico, Central American security, has been a terrific colleague to us. And thank you, Eric, for all of your hard work. And with that, I'm going to step down from the stage. I'm going to pass you back your copy of the agenda because I promised I would do that. And the word is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Duncan. And I can only say it's been delightful to work with you over these years and to be able to cooperate and collaborate with the Wilson Center and the Mexico Institute on this particular event, which is a source of great pride for me and a great, I think, a great event for us to look back and look forward. And so thank you for that opportunity. I also want to give a shout out to Angela Robertson for all her hard work behind the scenes. She was actually sick part of that time, so she did an amazing job to put all this together, and her colleagues have all rallied around her as well, and so we're delighted to have this event come off so well today. As Duncan said, this is an opportunity we like to take each year to look back a little bit to see what's happened, and then also look forward to what might come in the future and what are the areas that the government at the time needs to focus on and make changes on and improvements in. And so that's the tenor of our discussion. That's what we want to accomplish. And this first panel is really, I've described it a little bit as the 30,000 foot view of the big picture here. What are the strategic questions and what's really going on in Mexico? And our follow-up panel is full of experts on very specific things, and they'll go in deeper on a lot of the topics that we're going to mention here. I mean, it goes without saying this has been quite a year. In some ways, bad news or new record in homicides. The number of reported crimes across the board are at record levels, according to the government of statistics. So there's a lot to be concerned about, worried about. Incidents that just happened, like the shooting in the school in Culiacan, maybe didn't result in high numbers of casualties, but it's shocking nonetheless, especially in a country like Mexico that does not experience that kind of violence. And then the events like the one in Culiacan with Ovidio Guzman, I forgot, and the massacres of the Labaron family. But across the board, the country has really experienced a dramatic rise in homicides and violent crime that's very worrisome. On the other hand, this is the first year of the new government. They've now had a whole year in office. The fourth transformation, as they like to refer to it, is underway. We don't know which way it's going, but it's underway. We've begun to see campaign promises become a reality. For better or worse. We'll talk about that. We've begun to see what the president means by abrazos no balazos, right? Hugs, not bullets, or gunfights. What does that mean? Beginning to glimpse at what the government means about that, by that as well. We've seen the creation of a National Guard, a new institution. How solid it is, what it's going to do, those are open questions, but there's been that dramatic change institutionally in Mexico as well. There's a new federal attorney general, Fiscalía General. I have to remind myself every time that it's not a Procuraduría anymore. I finally learned how to say that in Spanish, and now it's back to Fiscalía. So it's important. I don't mean to make light of it. It's important. It's a step. Whether it's effective or not is another question, but those are important steps. And after resisting for many years pressure from the United States, and I was thinking even Alan Burson sitting in this room pressing Mexico to do a better job of border enforcement, border control, they've done it. They've now deployed forces to the Rio Suchiate. They've deployed forces in the north to do the kinds of border enforcement, border control that many in the U.S. government have pressed for a long time. Again, whether that's a positive or negative, whether it's effective or not, we will discuss that, and Marie Meyer will be a part of that discussion in the next panel. And Mexico has assumed for the first time a border control policy that I never expected to see in my lifetime. I wrote in about 6 years ago, Mexico will never do what the United States has done and deploy forces to its border to contain migration. Guess what? I was flat out wrong, and I'm willing to admit it. These are all important, incredibly important changes. And so we're delighted that we have some of the leading experts on these issues from Mexico and the United States. Let me just really briefly introduce our panelists, all good friends, all longtime allies and participants in Mexico Institute events. First and foremost, let me start with my good friend David Shirk, who's a global fellow here at the Mexico Institute at the Wilson Center, but also an associate professor at University of San Diego and the director of Justice in Mexico Project, has been following the issue of justice reform, police reform, training and professionalization of the justice sector for many years, and also does the premier report annually on homicides in Mexico and how those have evolved and changed over time. So we're delighted to have him here. He's going to talk about patterns and drivers of crime and violence in Mexico in 2019, and I'm sure he'll add other thoughts. Next, we hear from our good friend Edna Jaime. She's a global fellow at the Mexico Institute as well, but she's also the Director General of Mexico Evalúa, one of the premier think tanks in Mexico, focused on issues like transparency in government, rule of law. They do the best overall report on transition to justice and the rule of law in Mexico. She's a columnist in El Universal.
Financiero.
And really,
El Financiero.
El Financiero. I'm sorry, El Universal is sitting next to you. But anyway, but just a delightful and really thought-provoking member of the community, and we're delighted to have her on a panel. And then last but not least, our good friend, good old friend, hace muchos pelos que nos conocimos, Alejandro Ope. I think I almost don't need to explain who he is, but he is currently a columnist with the Universal, and also a joint project between IMCO and Mexico Evalúa. That's over? That finished? Okay, you solved that problem. But those of you who don't follow Alejandro, I think you really need to. His columns are excellent, always a reference point, always being shared. He had an old column called Plomo y Plata.
That's still called that.
It still has that name.
Yeah.
And I think it really looks at the two sides of this equation that we're going to discuss here in terms of security. But anyway, I've talked enough. Let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to start with David, who I believe has a presentation, and then we're going to.
Want me to stand up or?
It's entirely up to you, but we do need to leave people space to see
I'll
what.
move.
I know. So.
I won't block.
Que nos ven, ¿verdad?
Well, first of all, I want to thank Duncan and Eric and Angela for organizing this forum. It's a little bit dismaying that this is the 8th annual Mexico Security Forum, and to think of all of the terrible things that entails, the things that we've been observing over the last 8 years. Thank you so much. Gives a little cause for optimism. I'm going to talk as quickly as I can about everything that's happened in the last year or so, and some of the longer term trends. First of all, in terms of thinking about what's happened relatively recently on security trends in Mexico, as Eric mentioned, what we've seen over the last year has been a continued continued elevated level of violence in Mexico. The number of homicides this year will certainly surpass the number from last year, from the year from 2019 will certainly surpass the number from 2018, though not necessarily by that much. What you can sort of see here, looking at, this crazy, Mexico has multiple sources of homicide data. And so this tracks homicide data from both INEGI and from the National Public Security System here in blue. And you can see that we reached unprecedented levels for the blue line in 2018 and 2019. These are data through through November 2019 with an estimate for December that averages for the year. And what we see is that at least the one good thing you can say about 2019 is that the violence has not increased at the same rate that we've seen in the 2 or 3 previous years. So it appears to be leveling off in a way that it did back in 2012, roughly. And so if you're an optimist, you're thinking, well, maybe next year we'll start to see some declines. But all told, so far, under the AMLO administration, we've seen over 37,000 people killed. And that's significantly higher than the annual average than any other previous president noted on here. The second thing that is important to note is the fact that Mexico's homicide levels have each year consistently for the last few years driven up the per capita homicide rate. This is important technically to make sure that the increases we're seeing are not just driven by birth rates or increased population. And next year, once again, we will see a record level. For 2019, we will see a record level of homicides once we have final figures out from INEGI. I'm estimating that we're looking at a homicide rate of somewhere around 28 per 100,000. But we'll see. Final figures will be out sometime in mid-2020. A third obvious trend that we see when looking at homicides in Mexico, and this is a long-standing phenomenon, is the geographic concentration of those homicides in particular places. Violence is not random. The distribution of homicides throughout the country is not random. It's difficult to see in this PowerPoint, but we see that the concentrations of violence, and we're talking just concentrations of more than 40 homicides per municipality is the highest level of concentration here, are really quite defined in certain very specific regions that have been fairly consistent actually for a fairly long period of time, for the last decade or so. Looking at this clustering of homicides, we did an analysis last year and found that we saw over 2018, and I think again for 2019, a significant concentration in a small number of municipalities. If Mexico were willing to cede Tijuana and Juarez alone to the United States, they would drop their homicide rate by maybe 5%. And so I don't think that's in the plans for AMLO, but it is an option, a policy option. But in all seriousness, the concentration of homicides in Mexico has increased very dramatically. A quarter of all homicides are associated with the top 5 most violent municipalities in Mexico. So if you're thinking counter-violence strategies, obviously you want to have a very focused approach, and you want to take the National Guard and direct them to the places where you have the highest concentrations, not just scatter them around to 250 different municipalities where they're not really needed. What's really interesting is that these concentrations are actually lower than what we saw back in 2010, when the top 5 municipalities accounted for about a third of all homicides in Mexico. And so what this suggests is that actually violence is been somewhat more dispersed currently in the current wave of violence that we're seeing in Mexico than in the previous wave back in 2010 to 2012. Just looking at one example, we can see that this concentration effect, the localization of patterns of violence, also happens at the municipal level. We got data on colonial level data looking at neighborhoods in Tijuana and found very specific concentrations of violence in that city as well. The center where there's a lot more sort of activity and commerce, Sanchez Taboada, which has been a sort of hotbed of organized crime activity in the city for a long time. And then these eastern, relatively newly settled quadrants of the city, which have higher levels of violence. Last finding, and I'll stop with the long-term trends. One of the things I think is really important to take into consideration is that the current government of Mexico has taken office with the highest level of homicides of any of the recent governments that have taken office in the 21st century. So whereas Calderon, Fox, Peña Nieto all came in with the first year of violence at relatively low levels. It's been a rough year for the López Obrador administration. And arguably, I mean, if you're an optimist, you think, well, I mean, maybe things can only get better. Maybe López Obrador will have the advantage of seeing things go down over time, and we'll see what happens. Really quickly, what are some of the key contributing factors here? On the one hand, obviously we have to look at longer term sort of systemic problems, structural factors like the state of the economy, levels of inequality, distribution of poverty, problems of education, unemployment. These kinds of structural factors are often referenced by scholars as things that we need to deal with. But the thing about these kinds of structural factors is they're not very variable as a variable. Right? They don't change very dramatically necessarily from year to year or place to place. And so they're really useful at trying to understand what are the factors that contribute to the longer term development of an individual who leads to a life of crime, or that leads to a life of crime. But they're not very good factors for understanding the relatively rapid and the rapid fluctuations that we see in violence, or the different changes that we see geographically in the distribution of violence over time. And for that, we really have to look at organized crime dynamics, right? And the factors that are contributing to conflicts or increased competition between organized crime groups. And what we see is that those clusters I identified in the previous slide or in an earlier slide really point to the problem of fragmentation and competition among organized crime groups in Mexico, which are vying for control of very specific either production areas for drug trafficking or transit corridors for moving product into the United States. There are, of course, as a result of the fragmentation that we've seen, other considerations. But what I want to point out here is that the big cartels, the big drug trafficking organizations that dominated organized crime in the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s have broken down. And part of that is a result of our deliberate efforts. Part of this is a result of the success of targeted law enforcement operations to take out drug kingpins over the last 10, 20, even 30 years, going back to the Guadalajara cartel. And so these dynamics among the cartels, the competition that has been created among them, is at least in part an unintended consequence of law enforcement efforts. Of course, we've taken down Chapo Guzman. The new and rising criminal organization is the New Generation Cartel, headed by the New Generation of Jalisco Cartel, headed by Ruben Nemesio Oseguera, also called El Mencho. You can see that organization is actually was at one point part of the Guzman organization and broke away back around 2012 to form the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, and has very quickly asserted itself in places where Guzman's organization has been diminished or debilitated, and seems to be basically the successor organization to the Guzman organization. But this fragmentation effect has been identified by many different scholars and organizations. We've seen Mexico move from just having 2 major criminal organizations back in the 1980s to 4 in the 1990s to several in the 2000s and 2010s. And that is, of course, problematic because what that splintering has led to is also the breakdown of supply chain networks for trafficking drugs and the movement of these criminal organizations into other more predatory kinds of crimes like extortion and kidnapping. Now, these are very bad data because kidnappings and extortions are underreported, but we can see that over the last decade or so, there's been a real increase in these other kinds of criminal activities. You can also see, and we saw particularly in 2019, that diversification goes into new kinds of industries and new kinds of criminal activities, things like that we would call larceny in the United States, sort of grand theft activities, and one of the first tasks of the López Obrador administration was going after the so-called huachicoleros who are involved in fuel theft in key corridors of the country. Another implication, of course, is that some of these splinter organizations or smaller regional criminal organizations are less disciplined and more likely to prey upon innocent civilians. And we saw that, unfortunately, on November 4th, 2019, with the Labaron family massacre that Eric mentioned. And so all of this sort of fits into this pattern. What's to be done? The new administration has shifted to a policy of abrazos no balazos, hugs, not gunfights. And this is seen either as a very courageous stand to take by the administration in that they're not going to confront these organizations so that the kingpin effect will die down and they don't have to deal with those issues. On the other hand, many Mexicans view it as the Mexican state essentially abrogating its responsibilities to protect the public. But those are issues that I believe Alejandro and Edna are going to talk about, so I'm going to draw my remarks to a close. Oh, I will just do a quick plug. If you're looking for this kind of information, most of the stuff that I presented here is available in some of the reports that we have on our webpage, justiceinmexico.org. Thank you so much, and I'll look forward to the other comments.
Thank you. One of the things that I was thinking about is this issue of fragmentation and greater violence and competition that comes for that. There's an argument that fragmentation makes them smaller and therefore weaker, and it would be possible to address or tackle these problems more locally. I think that's what the strategy is in the United States. We address these things at the city level, at the state level in Chicago or New York or Boston or Washington, D.C. The problem is that you don't have very strong state or municipal police in capacity at the local level. And so fragmentation may be a way to weaken, but if there's no response from the state and local governments, it can create even worse conditions. So I'm going to turn it over now to Alejandro. Again, a columnist with El Universal, and he's going to talk about Mexico's new security strategy and the role of the National Guard. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Eric. Thank you very much to the Wilson Center. Thank you very much to all the staff who put up so much work to have this conference, and thank you very much to all of you to have to spend sometimes listening to what is happening in Mexico. I'm going to talk first about some of the pillars, what I think are the pillars of the security policy of the governor Andrés Manuel López Obrador, and then I'm going to provide a brief overview of what I think is happening with the National Guard. I know that Íñigo Guevara is going to provide a much more detailed assessment of this new body, but this can set up the discussion for later on. Let me put it this way. To say that the security policy of the new government is disjointed, I think is fair. They produced a document in April 2019 called the National Public Safety Strategy, which was really a really strange document because it wasn't really a strategy, it wasn't really national, it wasn't really about security. it talked about everything from social development to corruption to fuel theft to pretty much everything under the sun. But I think you can extract some themes out of that document and out of the praxis that the government has been or what the government has been doing over the past year or so. I think there are 4 pillars in this strategy. One and foremost is a centralization of decision making. The president brags about meeting his cabinet every single day from Monday through Friday at 6 a.m. and that he's pretty much in control of what is happening with security strategy every single day. I think there has been a trend to centralize all decision making in those meetings, and everything has to go through the president. And there has been also an attempt to reproduce that pattern of decision making at the state and local levels. Not very successfully, but I think there is this clear intention of the president, of his security team, that decision making should be made from the top down. Secondly, the president, there has been some talk and maybe some action, a bit of action in terms of what is termed as pacification policy. What is that? During the transition period, they talked, and during the campaign, they talked about transitional justice. They talked about bringing in criminal groups for maybe some type of a political arrangement. Nothing much has come of that, but there are at least a few pieces. One, there is a truth commission for the Ayotzinapa case. It has been working for at least a year. Not a lot of results have come out of that effort, but at least there is that piece of the puzzle. Secondly, there have been some. They passed a so-called amnesty law recently. It's very limited in its scope, very limited in its effects. It only applies to federal crimes, and not to local crimes, which means that given that 95% of all crimes in Mexico are local in nature, that doesn't really have a lot of impact. The government claims that it will benefit as much as 6,000 people, but that's still only 3% of the prison population. So I mean, it might be a step in the right direction of making the state somewhat less punitive, but it's still not too much. And of course, that is countered by other measures that are clearly much more punitive in their direction. Pre-trial crimes that detonate mandatory pre-trial imprisonment have tripled. And in 2019, for the first time since 2014, the prison population in Mexico grew, bucking a trend that had begun with the transition to a new criminal justice system. So of course, in this also broad space, there have been some talk about changes to drug policy, particularly on marijuana. The Mexican Supreme Court mandated the Mexican Congress to legislate on marijuana by October last year. The Congress failed to legislate, and the Supreme Court gave an extension to April. So maybe we'll see something of a marijuana legalization process beginning in April. But again, it's likely to be relatively small in its scope and relatively not very ambitious in its nature. Thirdly, and I think that this is a theme, and this is a trope that the president has been very adamant about, which is the tending to the social causes, to the deep causes of crime and violence, and putting forward a number of social programs to deal with those structural causes of crime and violence. I think a problematic approach to the issue, because they are not putting forward crime prevention programs. What they're putting forward is broad social programs that tend to many people that would not commit crimes anyway. There's one specific program called Jóvenes Construyendo Futuro, which is something of a training program for youth that do not have access to either education or jobs. I mean, 60% of its beneficiaries are women. Women tend to commit crimes at far lower rates than men. Most of the what they see as their social arm of security policy is not likely to produce a lot of effects in terms of crime reduction. They are too broad. They are not focused enough on at youth risk. They're not focused on people that are already are in conflict with the law. So I think the president puts a lot of hopes in this particular issue, but I don't think it's going to deliver. And finally, I think this is the most important part of it. There has been a significant reorganization of the security sector in Mexico over the past year. First and foremost, they recreated a security ministry. There was a public security ministry in Mexico between 2000 and 2012. Then it was folded in 2012. It was folded into the Secretaría de Gobernación, the Ministry of the Interior, and then it was brought back to life in 2018, which at least in terms of law, which much more broader powers than what the old Ministry of Public Security ever had. It not only includes all the bodies, all the agencies that were once part of the old SSP, but it now includes things like the CISEN, the Mexico Civil Intelligence Agency. It includes all the policy connected to disaster relief and civil protection. So it is a relatively powerful body, or at least in terms of its legal charter. And of course, as part of this reorganization, there is the creation of the National Guard. And let me give you some sense of what we know so far about the National Guard. It's still a work in progress. Again, Inigo is going to give you probably much more details about this. But what do we know so far about this, which is, I think, the centerpiece of the security policy of the new administration? What is it? Well, it's a police force with military design and outlook. It has some similarities to what would broadly be called a gendarmerie force or a constabulary force, i.e. something between the military and the police. And it's formally, and this is an important issue, formally it is part of the Ministry of Public Safety. The initial proposal was to locate this administratively within the Ministry of Defense. That created a lot of resistance, both in Mexico and abroad. So they decided to shift, and they located it administratively within the Ministry of Public Safety. What is it for? Well, it's not clear, but I think some of the themes that have been mentioned is that it's basic for territorial control. They want to put it everywhere. And it is a mean of increasing federal presence at state and local levels. And why on earth did this come to happen? One, this is part of a broader process that began probably in the 90s of a gradual, what I would call, nationalization of public safety, i.e. That the federal government taking charge of many parts of security that used to belong to local and state governments. And this has been a process that probably has been going on for 25 years for a number of reasons. Secondly, because the government, Andrés Manuel López Obrador and his team basically bought the emergency narrative. We're in the middle of a crisis. We need to do something. This is something we need to do this. There is no time for reflection, or there is no time for a broad debate on the merits of the proposal. We need to do something now. There is a deep mistrust towards the federal police. It was seen as, Calderón's police. It was deep mistrust, and I think the recent arrest of Genaro Garcia Luna, the former Minister of Public Safety in Mexico and during the Calderon years, has probably reinforced this narrative. And finally, there's probably the personal style, the personal trajectory of President López Obrador. His experience as a public official, or as an elected official, as mayor of Mexico City, where you have a really large police force, where you can deploy people basically, but you can order large deployments of personnel in a relatively small territory. When he gets to the federal level, when he gets to the presidency, he doesn't have that. He doesn't have a large police that he can deploy basically at will. And he didn't like it. He probably wanted to reproduce what he had in Mexico City. Does it look like foreign models? Well, to some extent. Maybe it looks kind of like the Carabineros in Chile. Maybe kind of looks like the national police in Colombia. Okay. In Colombia, but not too much. Those are, police officers trained as the military and not as the military serving as police officers. How big will it be? Well, it has probably right now 70,000, mostly military personnel. Medium term, it will be about 130 to 140,000 if recruitment goes met. So how military is this? Well, pretty much. This is a report from October. 80% of its personnel were military in origin. So it's the component of the federal police is relatively small. Where are they recruiting? In military bases. The army is recruiting for the National Guard. How are they being trained? I mean, this is they're being trained initially for just 7 weeks. And basically, if you look at, I'm not going to go this in detail, but basically, I mean, this is shooting practice every week, knowledge of weaponry every week. This is detention and conduction of detention and arrest of people 1 week. So it's clearly unbalanced. How are they deployed? Well, I mean, this is deployment by state. Kind of, I mean, look at the absolute numbers, doesn't look that bizarre. But if you actually look at deployment by troops per 100,000 inhabitants, then it becomes kind of weird. The state of Quintana Roo in southern Mexico is the one that has the biggest deployment, relative deployment, followed by Colima, followed by Zacatecas. There is absolutely no correlation whatsoever with either the homicide rate or with victimization rate. Absolutely no correlation whatsoever. It is what this suggests is that they are the deployment is following institutional inertia and not operational needs. Where is the National Guard? Where you had soldiers. To be and how much money being spent? This is really interesting. They only devote in the budget. They only passed 3.8 billion pesos for the National Guard. That is pretty much nothing. For the federal police, about 28 billion. But if you actually look at the components, there is not a red cent, not a single peso for equipment, not a single peso for investment, for building up the physical capacity. It's pretty much all for what is called personal services. But if you actually look within personal services, you see that there is not a single peso devoted to permanent salaries. So how on earth are they paying for this? This is a really bizarre administrative way of. So what does this suggest? That this is kind of a travesty. Well, it is completely led, whatever the law says, this is being led by the Ministry of Defense. This process is not, the civilian control over this is a joke. How are they growing? They're growing by simply transferring military personnel. That military personnel remains part of the military establishment. They're still members of the Army and the Navy. They're still being paid by the Army and the Navy. That's how they get to those numbers. The deployment is being driven by institutional inertia, not by operational needs. And this is important. There is no real border, none whatsoever, between the National Guard and the armed forces. The law says that there has to be, for someone to belong to the National Guard, there has to be a functional separation from the armed forces. This is being met by something called, in Mexican bureaucratic parlance, as an oficio de comisión. Just people are just being commissioned. You know what? Go there. And this is important. This is not a temporary situation. This is the design. There are no budget allocations to hire personnel, the National Guard in 2020. Not at the National Guard. There are budget allocations in the Army. There are budget allocations in the Navy. This is the design. This is an extension of the armed forces. Whether that is good or bad is a different is a different discussion. But let's be clear what the nature of this institution is. But all of what I said could be just in a footnote. The question will it work? I don't think so, because there is no increase in personnel. I'm sorry, but I'm taking too long. This is the last one. There is no increase in personnel in the short term. This is really something that has to be considered. The military units that are being transferred into the National Guard were already doing public safety work. They were already doing crime fighting. They were already deployed. So there is no net increase in the number of deployed troops. And there's probably the potential loss of personnel from the federal police, which has been mistreated really badly over the past year. So you have pretty much, at best what you have is the same people doing the same things in pretty much the same places, with the same equipment, same leadership, same doctrine, but different uniform. So unless the uniform is magical, has magical powers, you shouldn't expect much better results in the short term. Could they meet the recruitment goals? Well, yeah. But let me put it this way: there is net recruitment in the Mexican Armed Force between 1998 and 2019 was 34,000 troops. They want to do twice this amount in 3 years. So will they recruit? No. The National Guard will grow just by transferring people from the Army and the Navy. So the theoretical size of the National Guard is the size of the Mexican Army, pretty much. Which will, of course, will put increased strain on the Army and the Navy when they have to do other things. There are some legal problems, then potential legal challenges to this functional separation issue that I was talking about. There can be potential challenges to legality or arrest by the National Guard, because any semi-competent criminal lawyer, whenever faced with an arrest by the National Guard, would say, well, who are you? Well, I'm a member of the National Guard. So how you know that? Well, here's my official communication. Guess what? The law says that you have to be functionally separated from the Army. This is an illegal arrest. There are myriad administrative problems from this unorthodox arrangement, and crucially, this doesn't provide for institutional stability. Basically, the way it is being set up, the National Guard could be basically closed down within 24 hours, without going through Congress. To you know what? All the people are commissioned. You're no longer commissioned. Come back. So if a future government wants to get rid of the National Guard, pretty easy. So this doesn't provide for a long-term institutional construction. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, and let me just, again, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but mention, as Alejandro mentioned, Inigo's paper, which we'll talk about in the next page. He really does go into detail about how this came about and the various institutional arrangements that have changed over time, so very appropriate. So, hugs, not bullets. I think we oversimplify it by saying at times the soft side versus the hard side. We've talked a little bit about the hard side, the National Guard, and all the death and destruction that Mexico has faced. When I asked Edna what she wanted to talk about, she said, I want to talk about the social side, social program side of it, the hugs side of it.
Hugs.
Because this has been a big part of what the government has put forward as their strategy. So we're delighted to have Edna here with us, and adelante.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank Eric and Duncan for inviting me to this conference. I really appreciate it, Eric. As you know, besides having the honor of being a global fellow of the Wilson Center's Mexico Institute, I am the director of Mexico Evalúa. A kind of translation could be Mexico Assesses. It's a Mexico City-based think tank specialized in the analysis and improvement of public policies. Mexico Evalúa was founded 10 years ago, and ever since its creation, we have worked to understand the forces and dynamics behind the public security situation in Mexico. We have a public security program which has analyzed the public security policies followed by 3 administrations, Calderón, Peña Nieto, and López Obrador. There are 4 major conclusions that I draw from all these years of analysis and policy recommendations. The first is that we, Mexicans, are obsessed with the idea of finding the one security strategy, an omnipotent, omnipresent, and omniscient public policy emanating from the presidential office that will solve everything, from car theft to human trafficking, from narco executions to mugging in the streets, from feminicide to human rights abuses. Second, that as a result of our fixation with the one security strategy, we have neglected capacity building at the state and local levels. Our public debate is centered on the shortcomings of every president's security strategy. Governors and mayors have been conveniently left alone most of the time. Nobody expects much of them, so nobody demands much from them. Third, the main concern in the policy and political debate around security is how to strengthen the reactive response of the Mexican institution, of the Mexican state. Crime prevention policies are left almost completely out of the picture. And fourth, that whenever the concept prevention policies is mentioned, every public official, every politician, every journalist, and every pundit have their own definition and ideas. In Mexico, crime prevention policies means whatever the person mentioning the term wants it to be. Bringing a famous soccer player to talk to kids in a poor neighborhood, that counts as crime prevention. Music lessons at a rural community, that's crime prevention too. Dance lessons for teenagers, crime prevention, of course. Courses on how to fix home appliances, yes, it's crime prevention. Free AI glasses for students in a low-income district, definitely crime prevention. Everything that could be put under the blanket of reducing risk factors for violence and crime has counted as crime prevention. We had a lot of these activities in the past. From 2013 to 2017, the Peña Nieto administration spent around $600 million in the National Program of Crime Prevention. PRONAPRED is the acronym in Spanish. Improvisation mainly crippled this program. So the Peña Nieto administration ended the PRONAPRED in 2017. not a single evidence of how Pronapred helped to prevent crime was ever produced. And not surprisingly, President López Obrador deleted this program completely from the federal plans. But things do not look much better now. In the middle of all this confusion, there is a truism that has become a sort of golden rule of conventional wisdom. Poverty and inequality are the root of criminal behavior. No matter how strong or weak the evidence is, this is the new truth. If we want security, the poor need to be less poor. Mm-hmm. And what happens when crime prevention becomes practically the same as social policy? That virtually every public policy targeted to the poor or low-income households or persons can be labeled as crime prevention. And particularly for President López Obrador, the root of all evils is called neoliberalism. So, if the so-called neoliberalism policies are to blame for poverty and inequality, and poverty and inequality breed crime, the antidote to crime is to put the end to neoliberal policies. That's the rationale behind the social programs of President López Obrador. That is why he has been dismantling existing programs and substituting them with direct cash transfers to social groups like people with disabilities, the elderly, and young people enrolled in basic and middle years education. One of the main programs he launched is Jóvenes Construyendo el Futuro, or Young People Building the Future. Mm-hmm. This job subsidy program seeks to serve 2.6 million young people each year who are not in education, employment, or training systems. Mm-hmm. The program provides young people with 3,600 pesos a month, around 1.5 times the minimum wage. And we can discuss the merits of this program in terms of if and how it helps our young people to acquire skills and access to job opportunities. But for President López Obrador, this program is more than anything a way to win the competition with organized crime. He said, and I quote, "Prisons are full of young men. Those who are murdered are young men. We have to give them a chance, and we have to compete with criminal organizations and tell the gangs and criminals, okay, you are recruiting these young people, but I, the government, going to give them options. I don't want you to take them away. I don't want them to waste their lives." End of the quote. And as I have said before, the good news is that something is being done to address the problem of young people. There's a lot of merit in that. Judging the president approval ratings, the Mexican public agrees. But by any standard, this cannot be considered a sound crime prevention policy. As I have put it, these programs have a lot of heart, but they lack brains. Crime prevention policies are much more complex. Their design and implementation demand a lot of high quality local information of the dynamics of crime and violence at the neighborhood, even at the block level. Crime prevention policies need local diagnosis. Such diagnosis has to be made with the participation of those who live and understand their own communities, local police forces, municipal governments, social leaders, parent-teachers associations, neighborhood organizations. They cannot be designed from a desk in Mexico City. Crime prevention policies need to have evidence-based interventions. Crime prevention policies must include monitoring and evaluation systems. Saying how much money was allocated or how many people were supposedly benefited is not enough. Impact must be measured if we want to understand the social return to investment of this kind of interventions or policies. Well-designed crime prevention policies takes time, state capabilities, and very specialized human resources. Those things are lacking in today's federal government. And those things are also lacking in local governments. We also need local governments, state and local governments engaged in this endeavor. State and local governments need to assume the responsibilities in crime prevention. Prevention is a local policy. Federal government can do a lot, generating guidelines, providing technical assistance, helping to finance local responses. I insist, prevention is a locally based policy. Mexico urgently needs good prevention programs if we are going to solve our security crisis. This should be the top national priority. So I want to close with some remarks. And first is that even if these programs were successful in tackling poverty and unemployment, programs such as Jóvenes Construyendo el Futuro can hardly have a positive impact on criminal rates in the short run because of its very design. It is not targeted to those who are in risk. Social programs need to be more transparent for civil society and academia to help to improve them. And they need to have a twist in its design if they really want to attend risk factors associated to crime. It is very positive that 11 of the most important social programs of Presidente AMLO will be open to public scrutiny this year as the rules of operation will be made public. The third remark is that Mexico desperately needs local, well-designed, evidence-based crime prevention programs. And we need to change the terms of our conversation about security situation in the country. There is no a single national level strategy that will solve the myriad of problems that we have in every state and municipality. We have local responses too. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Edna. I appreciate your what you're saying, and I agree with it. It's not that hugs and a heart are a bad idea. We need to approach these problems from multiple directions, multiple dimensions, but we also need to be intelligent in using our hearts, and so I think that's right on. I like that way of framing it. So we'll have time for some questions. We'll take 3 at a time. Please make them short, to the point. Tell us who you are, and we will, let's see, we have a couple mics. We need you to be on mic because we are broadcasting this, streaming this to hundreds of millions of people around the world. I want to point out that our good friends at CACEDE are also streaming this in Mexico City at UNAM, so we want you to make sure and talk into the mic. So the young lady right here, and then our good friend right there, and then the ambassador. Why not? Yes, go ahead.
I'm
Can you hear the mic?
No.
Is it not working?
At the bottom.
Why don't we give the mic to Ambassador Michael here, and then we'll come back,
I
or
think
give
it's
her
working
that
now.
mic. You got it, or we give it a try.
Let's try again.
Ah.
Okay, great. Thanks. I'm Julie Montoya from Palladium. First, thank you very much to the Mexico Institute for organizing this event. I look forward to it every year.
Thank you.
This question is for anyone on the panel. Enrique Peña Nieto started his presidency with a different security strategy than the strategy he at the end of his presidency. In your opinion, what are the drivers, if you will, of Almo significantly changing his security strategy? For example, homicides not falling in the next 6 months?
Good. We had Ambassador Michael
porque
here, and then
que la-
Ambassador Ortega.
lo que empezó,
Okay, thank you. Jim Michael.
que podría
I
ser un cambio.
wonder, the new Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Report is out and identifies Mexico as the second most corrupt country on its list of the top 10. And I wonder if the panelists have some thoughts on how corruption and lack of public confidence in government programs is affecting public security and efforts like crime prevention in Mexico.
Great, thank you, and delighted to hear our panelists. But I just want to mention that Max Kaiser is going to speak on specifically on the corruption stuff. But I want to hear what these folks have to say as well. And then Ambassador Ortega.
Alfredo Miranda, DCM of the Embassy of Mexico.
I'm sorry.
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you so much for this opportunity to hear brilliant Mexicans coming to Washington to talk about this important issue that relates both countries. It's important for us to see that you have described, you have answered the question that Duncan Good asked. So what is the half? What is the half of the story? You have also answered. Mexico has a strategy on national security. Mexico is implementing this. And the question about corruption is the basic to understand many things in Mexico. Mexico, with more than 125 million inhabitants, with more than 1.1 trillion GDP, but also with more than 52 million of people living in the level above the level of poverty. So this is the scenario that we are living in Mexico, and that's why this crime situation is in the level that we have here, and we are really committed. The Mexican government is committed on this. I have so many comments about all the reference that you have done, but indeed I think that as a Mexican, I only can tell you that patience is very important in the moment that we see that the government is in its first year of office, and precisely once the government receive in the highest level of violence the situation in the country. And we as Mexicans, we are committed on working on this. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Let's get some quick responses here, and then if we have time, we'll ask another round of questions. So,
Let's go reverse order.
huh?
Should we go
Reverse order? Okay, Edna, you have the first.
Okay. To the question that if we can expect some changes in the policies, in this administration policies toward crime and violence, I think yes, we can expect some changes. I hope that we can have fine-tuning in some of the social programs in order that they can attend risk factors and that can become preventive policies. The way as they are designed now, they are not going to tackle risk factors, and they are not going to have an impact in crime and in violence. I think could be a good news is that Jóvenes Construyendo el Futuro, I have heard, I haven't seen it yet, is going to have a twist. It's going to have some fine-tuning in a way that part of the program is going to be focused to young people in risk situation. If that is it, I think that is a proof that the government can do fine-tuning in policies and we can do better prevention policies. But we have to see it. We have to see it. About corruption, Max is going to talk about it. But let me tell you that I'm not seeing any agenda that is focused in strengthening state institutions, and corruption is tackled with strong institutions. And we have this system that was created, pushed by the civil society, last administration, the National Anti-Corruption System, and it is not in the mindset of the president. And I think that without institutions, we are not going to win the battle against corruption. Mm-hmm.
Alejandro?
Okay, what could push for change in the current policy? Well, two things. One, probably patience with the government is going to decline gradually. People are still feeling somewhat optimistic about the chances of the administration to deliver results on security. I think that will change. So changes in public opinion could be one driver. A second driver could probably be politically motivated changes in personnel. It's likely that Secretary Durazo will probably leave his position at some point within next year because he wants to become governor of Sonora, which will hold elections in the middle of 2021. There could also be some changes in personnel at all the other levels, basically driven by the political calendar. So that could also be a driver. The U.S. pressure from the U.S. could also be a driver for policy change. The Mexican government, President López Obrador and Secretary Durazo have clearly stated that they don't want to continue with the KINGPIN strategy. My guess the Trump administration disagrees. Mm-hmm. So they will probably push for a more aggressive stance towards criminal organizations, and that might push the policy in a different direction. On corruption, I think, yes, I mean, I think corruption is one of the underlying factors for crime and insecurity. But having said that, I think we need to be more precise about what type of corruption is the driver here. And I think if you want to tackle corruption in security and justice institutions, there's a very specific agenda for that, and strengthening internal affairs units, creating police, civilian control, law enforcement. That is an agenda that is completely out of the radar of the current administration. They don't even talk about that. So the chances of significantly reducing corruption in law enforcement, I think, are very, very low. Thank you. And Ambassador, thank you for your comments.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. David?
First of all, I agree on the drivers of possible change in the administration. It's definitely, I think, possible for López Obrador to change his approach. I think he is more flexible than many people give him credit for, or than many people feared when he was coming into office. He changed very dramatically some of his policy positions from when he was a candidate to once he took office, and there is maybe more pragmatism in the administration than it's often given credit for. And so I do expect there to be some changes in policy, especially in response to the public reaction, assuming violence remains high. I mean, but if violence goes down, not necessarily because of the security strategy, but by luck, or because there's an arreglo among major organized crime groups, as has happened in the past, then I wouldn't expect any change. But there could be there could be change in response to public reactions. There could also be change in response to pressure from the Trump administration. But even there, while I agree with Alejandro on that, it's quite remarkable to see the ability of the López Obrador administration to negotiate with the Trump administration. And when Trump says we're going to declare Mexican criminal organizations as terrorists and go after them hard with counterterrorism resources, the López Obrador administration has been very adept at saying, hold on, let's talk about this and reconsider. And so there's more flexibility on the U.S. side, perhaps, than we might expect as well. But one thing to look at, particularly with regard to social programs, is the López Obrador administration, especially when thinking about Jóvenes Construyendo el Futuro, there are models from López Obrador's administration when he was the governor or head of the Mexico City government. Right? He had very targeted, focused crime prevention programs that deliberately focused on some of the hardest case youth. And so there is experience in the López Obrador government with working with those kinds of programs. My hope is that they will begin to focus more on the most at-risk youth, not just youth in general. On the second point about corruption, the effects of corruption on violence are generally, it's usually a negative correlation, right? The more corruption you have, the less violence, right? Because if everybody's on the take, there's nothing to fight about. So I think if you look back at Mexico in the 1980s, let's say, there was tremendous corruption and very little violence. And part of what's driven the violence, and we go into this in a little bit in the Wilson Center document that Eric put together, the Q&A document. Part of the challenge right now is that, in 2018, we saw the biggest election in Mexican history. And the number of positions up for grabs was enormous at the federal, state, and local level. We saw more political assassinations in the lead up to the 2018 elections than in ever before, since the revolution, right? So the part of what's driving the dynamics of violence is that there are so many seats up for grabs, if you will, in trying to corrupt Mexican institutions. And the fact that there is basically competition for state protection, or greater competition for state protection than we've seen perhaps at any time in the recent history, is maybe part of the equation. And on the last point, the importance of patience. And the fact that this administration is taking over at a time of unprecedented levels of violence for a new administration, I think that's a fair point. But and I'm personally incredibly pragmatic. The reason I'm always optimistic about Mexico is that I have relatively low expectations and a long time horizon. But I don't think that the Mexican public should have that same outlook. I think that if I were a Mexican citizen, and I'm not one of the brilliant Mexicans that the Wilson Center has brought up, I'd be outraged. Right? In the same way that I'm outraged right now in my country about 90,000 Americans dying from opioid addiction. And so I think a little bit of impatience is really important to help drive change. And that's why I'm so appreciative of my Mexican colleagues and the work that they do to push the Mexican government just a little bit and be a little bit impatient. So I would encourage you to still be impatient.
Thank you. And I appreciate you putting it in that context, David. It's not like there was peace and tranquility 2 years ago when the Peña Nieto administration was in office, and then suddenly it blew up under AMLO. So let's be honest about that. They're faced with an enormous challenge. So we are running out of time. I'm going to take 2 questions from our good friend in the back there, just so I don't get geographic criticisms, and if there's any over here, so those 2, and then we're going to have to cut it for now. Go ahead.
Rafael Bernal from The Hill. Criticism of the López Obrador administration is all their structural reforms, or many of their structural reforms, have served to concentrate power in Mexico City and in the presidency. Can you make an assessment looking at the security landscape a year on, as it says up on the board? Can you make an assessment of what has been prioritized, whether concentrating political power in Palacio Nacional has overtaken the idea of tackling security challenges or vice versa?
Good. And let's go ahead. Just
Hi.
one last question.
Eugenio Weigen with the Center for American Progress. I noticed that the title is U.S. Mexico Security Conference, and I think one of the issues that sort of combines both countries is illegal trafficking of weapons. Mexico's now has not access to guns for criminal groups, but now citizens are also armed with guns, and we see that when any conflict, whether it be drug trafficking or domestic violence even, or now, unfortunately, the incident in Torreon, when there's access to guns, the levels of lethality just simply rise. I know that there's many talks about what the U.S. can do, and I know those very well. I was hoping you can talk about what can Mexico do to address the problem of access to guns, illegal guns from the U.S., and what can be done with the stock of guns that are already in circulation in Mexico.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I think Animal Politico this week had a report that homicides from gunfire doubled in the last 4 years. So it's clearly a huge issue. And I know at Mexico Evalúa has done some work in this area. So has David. Anyway, we have very little time, but I would like your final thoughts here in response to these good questions.
A very short answer to the first question is at the beginning, when the president announced its strategy towards crime, the first movement was to concentrate decision making, as Alejandro said. But I think he's acknowledging that he alone he's not going to be successful, and now he's starting to point out to governors and to mayors about its responsibility in security issues. So I think that the first movement was, I will concentrate the decision making. I am responsible of the security, but little by little he's taking account state governors and you know, and I think he's acknowledging he's not going to be successful alone, and I hope that it will move to an agenda where we can fix our arrangement, our federal arrangement in this matter.
Alejandro?
Okay, concentration power. I think that's a crucial. I think that's an important issue. I think the use of the use of National Guard and the concentration of effort in that specific body, national body, I think can create a lot of nasty perverse incentives at the local level. Because you see it and you hear it from mayors, you hear it from governors. You know what? The National Guard is here, no longer my problem. Whenever there's there's a massacre somewhere, you know what the governor is going to say? Ask the guy from the National Guard. So that is one way. Illicit trafficking of guns. What can Mexico do? Short answer, not too much. Longer answer, well, you could reinforce customs controls at the border, north-south traffic. You could probably try to dismantle some of the networks that traffic guns within Mexico. Try to maybe improve some cooperation with ATF and other U.S. agencies. But at the end of the day, I'm not sure you can do a lot about the guns from the supply side in the same way that you cannot do too much about drugs on the supply side. Because my guess is that the price elasticity of demand for guns in Mexico is close to 1. It is very inelastic that even if, say, you were to triple the price of an AK-47 in Mexico, that would be just a very, very small share of the income, of the available income of our criminal organizations. And say that if miraculously we were to stop illicit trafficking today, for some reason, according to the Small Arms Survey, there are something like 15 million illegal weapons in Mexico, in private hands. So my guess is that is enough to keep the violence going for quite a while. So I'm not very optimistic about what the policy choice is in Mexico on that issue.
Good. David, you have the final word.
What is 15 million times 5,000? All right. So it would cost $75 billion to buy at an exaggerated price all of the firearms in Mexico.
Yeah.
That's too high a price probably for the Mexican government. But one thing you could do is just pay more for those firearms than the DTOs are paying for them. So gun buyback programs.
But you could that creates kind of a nasty incentive.
Yes, no, the gun manufacturers would love it because they would sell you those guns at half that price. But one thing that Mexican government insisted on back in September with the Trump administration is a monthly binational commission report on firearms trafficking. I think that one thing the Mexican government could do is to really take advantage of that concession from the Trump administration to make a big deal about the firearms issue every month and draw attention to whatever figures or numbers they're getting or not getting when it comes to efforts that the U.S. government is making on firearms trafficking. Of course, the U.S. government has insisted that it's Mexico's responsibility to man their ports of entry and that the U.S. doesn't have necessarily a responsibility to do that, just like we have a responsibility to man our ports of entry and prevent Central American migrants from coming in. But we've asked the Mexican government to help us. The Mexican government can do the same. And one thing that the Mexican government can do uniquely that the U.S. government cannot do by law, partly because of political pressure from the NRA and gun rights groups, is to actually maintain data sets on the number of firearms and the specific firearms that are seized that originate in the United States and that are traced by ATF. So here in the United States, this is a weird fact of the United States. Our federal law enforcement agencies are not allowed to maintain registries or any information about the firearms that we've traced. We are allowed to do those firearms traces, pass that information on to the Mexican government, but then our agencies have to surrender that information or delete that information from their computers. But gosh, as a researcher, I would sure love to have the list of all the firearms that have ever been seized in Mexico, what the manufacturers were, so that those manufacturers could be named and shamed, and so that those and so that the trends, what are the calibers, what are the different firearms types, where are they being deployed? Making data more accessible will make it more possible for us to draw attention to the problem, shame manufacturers, and even pressure the U.S. government into taking action on firearms. So I've said this several times. I really would love to see more access to information on what the Mexican government has with regard to the firearms that they're seizing.
Two more little points on the firearms thing. Mexico and the U.S. did launch Operation Frozen. Has nothing to do with a movie. It has to do with Frozen 3. But better inspections on the border. I'm not opposed to inspections on the border, but my opinion has always been, and I think David and I have discussed this, you're not going to solve this problem on the border. The U.S. has to confront the fact that there are trafficking networks operating in this country whose sole job is to bring firearms back to Mexico. And that's a tough problem to crack, I admit it, but that's the reality. And so that has to be part of it. The second thing, and I think Selena included this in her paper, we can't forget that there's a significant amount of seepage of firearms from law enforcement and the military in Mexico into the hands of criminals. And okay, I'm not trying to take the responsibility of the U.S. away, but that's a problem. And Mexico can and should do something more about that issue. And finally, I neglected to say, and David mentioned, he and I put together frequently asked questions, a Q&A on security in Mexico. It will be a document that we update periodically, but tries to answer a lot of these general questions that we all have about U.S. Mexico assistance and the security situation. We have printed out there. It'll be online, so avail yourself. We have about 10 minutes for a quick coffee break. I'd like to stay on time here, so we appreciate your coming back. Please join me in thanking our excellent panelists.